We're starting a sermon series, second week of the sermon series, Discovering God. And if you remember right, last week we talked about Paul and this book of Galatians. And we talked about the revelation that he said that he had on the Damascus Road. We talked about that revelation, actually the word that's used for revelation being an apocalypse, like a major life event. Something that totally destroyed his world or his understanding of the world, his understanding of faith. Paul, this devout Jew, all of a sudden in this moment transformed. From being a devout Jew who was persecuting and killing Christians, all of a sudden he becomes this evangelist proclaiming the name of Jesus. Paul on the way to Damascus, and his life is completely and utterly changed. This event changed the way he viewed God, and it changed the way he understood himself. Paul went from this point of understanding, knowing a lot about religion or knowing a lot about God, to all of a sudden knowing Jesus. There's a difference, isn't there? Think about that just for a minute. Is there a difference between knowing a lot about religion and knowing Jesus? Understanding, or what we think we understand about God, versus actually seeing and knowing and having a relationship with the Son of God. But now let's remember, it wasn't an instantaneous change. To be fair to Paul, it did not happen like boom overnight. I mean, he was struck and he was blind, and then he had to have the scales removed, but it still wasn't an instantaneous change. Let's look at what happened, at what Paul did after this revelation that he received. What was his response to the revelation? Well, if you remember right, last week we read, it said that he didn't console with anybody right away. He didn't go and seek wisdom. What it says that he did is he went off to Arabia. He went and hid in the desert for 3 years. He had to pray about this. He wasn't quite sure. I mean, he had this God-sized, like, slam in the face, if you will. He had this encounter with God that literally shook his world, destroyed the world that he thought he knew, and he wasn't quite ready to just give everything up yet. So he went to the desert, he prayed, he contemplated for 3 years. And after 3 years, then it says that he went and he visited Peter and stayed there for 15 days and kind of just, then he counseled with Peter and said, hey, have I got this right? Do I understand things? And then it says that he began to live missionally. He began to go out and do some mission and ministry after 3 years and after some counsel. And he began to preach the gospel, start some churches. And it says that people were absolutely amazed by his transformation. Can you imagine the rumors? Hey, this guy that used to be killing us, this guy who was out to get us no matter what the cause, and he was looking to crucify us and kill us and stone us. He's the one who was overseeing the stoning of people, of Stephen. And all of a sudden, he's preaching the gospel. Something radical has happened. Something dramatic has changed his life. 14 years later, fast forward if you will, it says that he goes back to Jerusalem in response to a revelation. Whether it's the first revelation encounter on the Damascus Road or whether another, we're not sure. But it says that Paul went again and he took Barnabas and he took Titus with him. And in a private meeting with those who were leading the church, Paul laid things out to the leaders. And he asked them just to clarify, hey, am I understanding this right? I just want to make sure that I'm running, what I'm doing it right. I'm teaching it right. I want to make sure that my teaching is solid according to your understanding of Jesus. Now, if you think about it, why did he go to them for clarity? Because often he kind of exalts himself in some ways and says, I had this personal relationship with Jesus. But he also knew that these disciples, they had spent 3 years in a relationship with Jesus. They spent 3 years learning who Jesus was and walking side by side with Jesus and watching the miracles and hearing him preach and teach. So let's just go back through this response to revelation. There's 4 things that Paul does that I think is valuable. And I want to point this out because I think anytime that we have an encounter that we believe is divine, or we believe God is directing us, or maybe we're not even sure, but we have questions, we should go through a response process. We shouldn't just jump off the cliff if somebody says jump off a cliff. We shouldn't, also just push it off and say, well, that doesn't make any sense, and I don't agree with that. We shouldn't do that either. We should listen when we hear that God is working or doing something. We should listen. So here's the things that Paul did, just to review. He says, we notice that he went into contemplation for 3 years in the desert. Now, I don't expect that any of us are going to go 3 years in the desert to contemplate, but I do think that we can take time to pray. We can take time to just set our hearts or let our hearts rest in what we hear God saying. The second thing that he does is he seeks wise counsel. He goes to those who knew Jesus, those who had a relationship with Jesus, and I think that's something else that we can do. When we have questions or we're struggling with something, why do we try and figure out all the answers on our own? When God surrounds us with people that can help give us wise counsel. And then he seeks accountability. In the middle of that, he also goes out and he lives missionally. He lives missionally with the people and begins working with them, and then he seeks accountability. He says, hold me accountable to this. That's why he goes back 14 years later and says, hey, I just want to check. Am I doing this right? Do I have all these things in place? Am I teaching the gospel that you would have me teach? Let's look at the transformation that took place in Paul's life when he allowed the revelation to impact him. Let's just think about this for just a moment. Paul, before Damascus, who was he? He was the religious elite. He had kind of put himself in the place of the religious community as the gatekeeper, the one who would say, hey, I'm the one who decides if you are following the right path. And Christians obviously weren't, because they saw Jesus as this Messiah that he didn't believe in. So he was the gatekeeper. He was the one who kept the religion pure. He was the one who was persecuting Christians for the things that they believed. He was seeing that they were killed. He was the one who disdained Gentiles, reviling those who were uncircumcised and saw them as outsiders. He was, in his day, the religious elite. But after his revelation, his apocalypse that destroyed his old life, that transformed who he was, all of a sudden, going into contemplative response, waiting on the Lord, seeking counsel, all of a sudden he becomes this person that realizes that, hey, the Gentiles aren't left out. Hey, they're not circumcised. It's okay. He realized that Jesus broke the door wide open. Being a child of God is open to anyone through Jesus Christ. He realized it's not about the law. In fact, he says that many times, not just in the book of Galatians, but in many different places. He realizes it's not about the law. It's not about physical perfection. It's not about cleanliness or the old code. It's not about doing things perfect like he used to think. Instead, it's about faith in Jesus Christ. You know, when we experience God, when we know Jesus, when we have a revelation that changes our life, an apocalyptic encounter with the divine, it should change us completely, shouldn't it? It shouldn't leave us the same. Think about that for just a moment. Maybe we should ask ourselves this question. Have I really encountered God if I haven't found a point in my life where things began to change, where things were so radically different than the old life, and I see things in such a radically different way? Then have I really, truly encountered the divine? Actually, let's look at a different kind of transformation, because this happens in this passage as well. Paul is starting to get a little frustrated. In fact, I encourage you all to go home and read the book of Galatians. It's short. You can read it in just 15 minutes. Well, I'll give you 30 minutes tonight. Really, Paul started this church. He loves this church. But over time, he finds out that the church of Galatia has changed. All of a sudden, they're starting to require this community, who is a Gentile community, they're requiring that they have to follow all the laws. They have to be circumcised, which isn't a part of their culture, isn't part of their expectation. And this is a contentious thing between Paul and, you find out later, Peter, about, what's right. And that's part of the reason he went back to Jerusalem and says, is this right? Do they have to follow all these codes? I mean, I know that the Jews still follow these codes, but this is a Gentile community following God. So they started, in his mind, to become who he had been before his revelation. They started to become focused on the laws and the regulations of the Old Testament, or of the code that they had established, that he had been so caught up on before. They started believing that salvation was through the law. Think about this. Essentially what happened in that church, that little church was having little mini revelations, or people were beginning to teach or beginning to proclaim that, hey, we're a church, so you've got to do everything the same way that church over there does it. The first church, you've got to follow this, and you've got to worship this way, and you've got to make sure that everybody's circumcised, and you wash your hands on this, and it was about the laws. They responded, but not like Paul. They didn't respond by contemplating or going out and praying for 3 years. They didn't go to Jerusalem and seek counsel from others. They didn't start living missionally. They started adhering to laws. And Paul has a serious problem with this. In fact, this is what Paul would call conforming to the world. Even within a church, they were conforming to what the world, or what the previous understanding had been. As it says in Romans 12:2, he says, do not be conformed to the world any longer, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. See, Paul says that they miss the point. He says, if you're going to get all caught up on these old laws, if you're going to get caught up and think you have to do everything the same way that they do it in Jerusalem, you've got it wrong. If you think you have to circumcise, you've got it wrong. That's not the focus. Even though they do that way over there, it's okay, let them do that. That's their culture, that's their code. But Paul pointed out to them that was a gross misunderstanding of the grace and love of God in Jesus Christ. See, I'm convinced anytime you have revelation, you have new understanding, anytime within community there's a new behavior or new information or transformation, whatever it may look like in different communities or cultures, I believe we need to and are required to seek a response, a faithful response. How do we go about intentionally responding to the things of our culture that are different here than elsewhere? How do we go about proclaiming the gospel in a different culture or community? How do we go about living in faith when we encounter a revelation in our own life? I believe it requires these 4 things, and I'll go through them again: contemplation, seeking wise counsel, living missionally, and maintaining accountability. And I'm going to tell you right now, in your life, you may not feel like, hey, I don't have a revelation or anything going on, I don't have to worry about this. But you might, and you just haven't acknowledged it yet. Not only that, but if you haven't, you will. Encounter a moment where God doesn't seem like the God you used to think God was. Or God doesn't quite fit in the same box that you thought God fit in. Think about Paul. Paul had God defined. Paul had God in a box, and everything was set, and all of a sudden this revelation changed everything. For Paul, it wasn't about the law. It wasn't about circumcision. It was about the love of God in Jesus Christ. That was the same love, as he says repeatedly, the same love for the Jew and for the Gentile and for everyone. It became Paul's non-negotiable. Paul simply laid it out there and said, hey, you're fighting over stuff that's not that important. The one thing that is important is the love of God in Jesus Christ that is open to everyone. See, the truth is, not every expression of faith is a faithful witness to God. We have to discern, we have to respond to revelation carefully. We don't want to assume that what we already know is right. And we don't want to assume that what we see on Facebook, by the way, is right. We don't want to assume that even what you hear preached is right. You have to go to the Word of God, and you have to seek the presence of God in contemplation. And then you have to seek wise counsel, live missionally, and maintain accountability. Like Paul, I think we have to not assume that everything that we've learned from our childhood is always right. We have to face the changes in our culture. We have to discern what God is doing. And look at how Paul responds. After his revelation, Paul realized specifically that the way that one community practices their faith could look very different than another community or than another culture. Even the laws that they adhered to were different. For him, it was about the love of God in Jesus Christ for all people. When you travel, whether Honduras or anywhere else, you find that the communities, the religious codes, the expectations, everything is a little bit different anywhere and everywhere you go. But the one thing that remains the same is the name of Jesus Christ. Think about this. The Jews in Jesus' day, in Paul's day, they held to the Old Testament law and circumcision, even the Christian church in Jerusalem. But the Gentiles didn't. The Jews still had certain food regulations, and in fact, they had a little bit of challenge with that, even with Peter. The Gentiles didn't. Their practices of faith and law were different. But the love of God in Jesus Christ remained the same. Let me ask you this. Let me just think about this for just a moment. Have you ever had an experience that expanded your understanding of God so much so that all of a sudden it becomes disorienting? Maybe you, like this week, you've had a loved one or a friend die unexpectedly, diagnosed with a disease. All of a sudden what we thought we knew or how we thought we understood God changes. It's challenged. Where is God in the midst of that? Or maybe, like some of us did this week, you travel to a foreign country and you, like Honduras, Colombia, you look in the eyes of someone or see a child that's too young to go to school that's been out working, picking coffee beans just so the family has enough food. And all of a sudden you see a face. And you have a face to put on a group of people that previously in your mind maybe only held a label. You see, there are so many experiences in life that can be a revelation. That can be an apocalypse that can literally destroy our old self and our old understanding of the gospel, of who Jesus is. We're changed, and our faith is impacted by our experiences. Experience that helps us realize our previous understanding of God is inadequate. Part of Paul's response to revelation: contemplation, wise counsel, living missionally, and accountability. he realized he was not in control. And he realized that his previous understanding of God, even with all of the laws and the codes and the otherwise, was too small for God. So I want to tell you today, whatever you have experienced in your life, or whatever you may be experiencing currently, whatever you may be struggling with, or the church may be struggling with, I think we have to remember that to have a faithful response requires deep contemplation, seeking wise counsel, living into it missionally, and then continuing to keep a relationship of accountability. I pray that as you encounter moments of revelation, that you will be open like Paul, that you will allow your world to be changed, that the love of God in Jesus Christ will continue to get bigger and bigger.